The corridor of Meridian Point Station hummed with the steady vibration of artificial gravity plates, a sound that Corporal Jax had learned to tune out years ago. His handheld scanner gave a low, quiet beep, noting a discrepancy in the cargo manifest of a pod labeled as simple grain shipments. The weight distribution on the platform did not match the paper trail, sitting far too still for organic produce. Jax raised a hand to ask the dock officer for a manual inspection, but his voice was cut short by a harsh, grating laugh echoing off the polished steel plating. It belonged to Kike Dornay, the lead commander of the Threxy Vanguard, whose wall of gray armor made Jax look like a slender shadow by comparison. The little scanner brought its little human, Dornay mocked, speaking loudly enough for the surrounding station staff and visiting diplomats to turn and stare. He gestured dismissively toward Jax's standard issue, low-cost uniform and basic sidearm, treating him less like a fellow security contractor and more like a malfunctioning tool found on a scrap heap. Grain doesn't shoot back, boss. Go stand somewhere useful and let the professionals handle real logistics. Jax did not argue, knowing from long and bitter experience that debating someone whose mind was already locked against reason only wasted precious breath. He simply stepped back, let the suspicious cargo pod slide through unchecked into the station's interior, and filed the strange mass reading away into his own personal memory logs where rank could not quietly erase it. This assignment was supposed to be quiet, a simple matter of keeping a high-profile target breathing through a delicate interplanetary summit without drawing any attention to himself. Meridian Point was hosting delegates from 12 border worlds, all gathered to sign a unified defense pact against the encroaching shadow of the Scar Dominion. Every other delegation had arrived surrounded by glittering, hyper-expensive security details decked out in gold-plated armor and long records of ceremonial combat. Jax's employer had chosen him because he came cheap, cheap enough that nobody in the Concord believed a human newcomer deserved anything better. He didn't mind being cheap, but as he watched the heavy cargo pod disappear deeper into the station's labyrinthine docks, a cold certainty settled in his chest telling him that everyone else was dangerously wrong. Ambassador Princess Lyra of the outlying border worlds moved through the docking concourse with a fluid, unhurried grace that defied the constant hum of political tension surrounding her. She carried the weight of 12 frightened systems on her shoulders, knowing that if this defense pact failed, her people would face the full, unyielding fury of the Scar Dominion alone. As she passed Jax, she glanced his way with a sharp, assessing look that caught every detail of his worn uniform and lack of flashy equipment. Unlike the other delegates who either sneered or ignored him entirely, Lyra didn't say a word, simply filing his presence away in her sharp mind before continuing down the corridor, flanked by her retinue. Kike Dornay immediately fell into step beside her, his massive armored chest puffed out as he recited the Threxy Vanguard's credentials at top volume. 60 years of service, 40 successful campaigns, and 0 client losses rolled off his tongue like a rehearsed marketing pitch designed to justify his exorbitant fee to the Planetary Council. He walked directly past Jax as if the human were nothing more than a fixture of the floor plating, entirely unaware of the irony dripping from his own words. Lyra caught Jax's eye for a single, fleeting second as Dornay boasted about invulnerability, and in that look, the princess acknowledged the silent gulf between loud, expensive posturing and quiet, functional reality. Behind the diplomatic posturing, the summit's central hall was a massive chamber ringed with vulnerable viewing windows looking out into the cold expanse of space. Jax immediately catalogued every exit, every blind spot, and every potential hazard with the automatic precision of a soldier who had survived wars that the Concord had never written history books about. He noted the lazy, unfocused sweeps of the Threxy guards stationed near the northern entrance, professionals who relied entirely on their heavy armor rather than active observation to keep threats at bay. He knew that expensive gear created a dangerous illusion of safety, blinding those who wore it to the subtle, quiet ways that real danger liked to creep into a room when nobody was watching. The evening reception stretched on for hours, filled with careful speeches about unity and shared survival that masked the underlying terror gripping every single delegate in the room. Jax stood near the perimeter, his eyes constantly moving across the crowd while Kike Dornay held court near the refreshment tables, using Jax as the punchline for another loud joke about weak human allies. The surrounding diplomats laughed politely, playing their political games while oblivious to the fact that the station's security grid was currently handling a massive influx of unverified traffic. Nathaniel Cross, the exhausted head of station security, found Jax near an eastern doorway and quietly confirmed that the manual inspection of the suspicious cargo pod had been delayed until morning due to a severe backlog. Jax kept his expression completely neutral, though every instinct forged in his forgotten past screamed that a delayed security check during a summit of this magnitude was a fatal mistake. He knew that pushing the issue tonight would only validate Dornay's constant claims about paranoid, jumpy humans, potentially fracturing the fragile political alliance before the ink on the treaty was even dry. Instead, he nodded, accepted Cross's assurance, and spent the remainder of the night walking the empty corridors during the station's dim cycle. His mind kept returning to the strange mass reading of the grain pod, a persistent itch at the back of his neck that refused to let him rest while the rest of the station slept soundly under false pretenses. Down in Dock 4, hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic oversight and automated scheduling queues, the heavy crate sat quietly in the dark, waiting for the right moment to unfold. Jax patrolled the upper walkways alone, his boots making barely a sound against the metal grating as he mentally mapped out every possible escape route for the princess. He had long ago made peace with the fact that sleep was a luxury for people who didn't carry the ghosts of dead comrades, using the silent hours to stay sharp while empires played diplomacy. The quiet of the station felt heavy, like the breathless stillness of a forest right before a lightning storm breaks, and Jax braced himself for the inevitable dawn that he knew would bring fire. Morning arrived with the abrupt shift of station lighting from dim blue to harsh white, bringing a fresh wave of political maneuvering and nervous chatter to the concourse corridors. The delegates gathered for a closed-door morning session, walking down a narrow private passageway that connected the residential quarters to the main conference hall. It was a transitional space, a routine bottleneck that security teams usually overlooked because it was shielded by 3 layers of station-wide identity checkpoints. But routine is precisely where an experienced saboteur finds their opening, knowing that human beings naturally lower their guard once they believe they are safely inside friendly territory. As Princess Lyra walked between 2 heavily armored Threxy guards, a catering attendant pushing a standard drink cart made a sudden, lightning-fast motion toward the underside of the table beside her seat. Jax caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. It was a fraction of a second too fast, a motion that lacked the natural rhythm of a tired worker. Without pausing to think, his body reacted with terrifying efficiency, closing the distance across the room, slamming the attendant to the deck, and snatching a small, dark device just as its interalarming sequence clicked. The gadget was engineered to induce silent, untraceable cardiac arrest, designed to remove the princess from the summit permanently without ever sounding an alarm. Station security flooded the corridor less than a minute later, but the critical moment had already come and gone while the expensive guards were still reacting to the commotion. Kike Dornay quickly recovered his composure, letting his supporters spin a narrative to the arriving delegates that the Threxy vanguard had bravely intercepted an assassination attempt. Jax didn't correct them, knowing that exposing the truth would cause a panic and shatter the illusion of competence that the Planetary Council desperately needed to maintain. Cross scanned the captured attacker's biometric data, only to find that the file had been completely scrubbed by a ghost with high-level clearance, proving to Jax that a patient, highly resourceful enemy was already inside the gates. High above the central chambers in the station's observation gallery, Princess Lyra found Jax standing quietly against the reinforced glass, looking out into the cold blackness of space. She thanked him softly for intercepting the device, acknowledging that his quick reflexes had saved her life while the guards she was paying a fortune for had been looking the other way. Jax offered his usual deflection, claiming it was simply part of a cheap contract, but Lyra refused to accept the brush-off, noting that his redacted service record hid something far deeper than an ordinary security background. She walked away leaving him alone with his thoughts, but the brief conversation cemented a mutual respect built on competence rather than flashy titles. Shortly after she departed, Kike Dornay cornered Jax near the gallery entrance. his face darkened by suppressed rage over being publicly shown up by a human contractor. The Threxy commander muttered low threats, warning Jax to stay out of his unit's way and accusing him of undermining station morale with his reckless interference. Jax stared back with absolute calm, refusing to engage in a petty ego contest while a much larger threat was quietly assembling beyond the horizon. Dornay eventually stalked off toward the medical bay, leaving Jax to stare out at the distant star field where long-range sensors were beginning to pick up faint, anomalous energy signatures crawling through the void. Down in the security hub, Grace Ellery and Nathaniel Cross were staring at a tactical display that turned the blood in their veins cold. Long-range array sweeps had just revealed a dozen Scar Dominion warships moving in a tight, masked boarding formation, heading directly toward Meridian Point with terrifying speed. They weren't coming to bombard the station from orbit, they were coming to board it quietly, timing their arrival precisely around the summit's final closing ceremony when all 12 world leaders would be gathered in one room. Jax walked into the hub just as the numbers flashed on the screen, feeling the cold, familiar weight of an old nightmare settle into his bones as he realized his worst suspicions were coming true. The security office erupted into urgent motion as Cross desperately tried to contact docking control while Ellery ran tactical comparisons against known Scar military doctrines. The realization that the suspicious grain pod in Dock 4 was actually a Trojan horse insertion mechanism hit them with brutal clarity. Without waiting for authorization, Jax, Cross, and a small team sprinted toward the docking bays to inspect the crate before it could be triggered from the outside. But they were already a fraction of a second too late. As they rounded the corner into Dock 4, a sharp, internal explosive charge blew the heavy metal casing outward in a cloud of smoke and flying debris. 3 compact, heavily armored Scar shock troopers unfolded from the crushed storage compartment with terrifying, unnatural speed, moving with the cold synchronization of elite killers. Cross went down instantly, caught in the shoulder by a non-lethal stun round, while Jax lunged forward, dragging the station security chief behind a heavy support pillar. Alarms shrieked to life across every deck of Meridian Point as the automated lockdown protocols engaged, turning the peaceful diplomatic station into a war zone in a matter of seconds. Through the gap in the dock doors, Jax caught a horrifying glimpse of a massive boarding vessel easing smoothly into the breach, disgorging waves of heavily armed troops into the station's corridors. Kike Dornay and a squad of Threxy Vanguard members met the initial wave of attackers at the main junction outside the security offices, their heavy armor absorbing the opening volley of plasma fire. For the first few minutes, Dornay's arrogant confidence seemed justified as the Threxy lines held firm, trading heavy blows with the disciplined Scar Raiders. But Jax knew that this was merely an opening probe, a calculated sacrifice designed to draw the station's primary defenders into a grinding war of attrition while the main force moved toward the summit hall. He secured Cross and Ellery inside the command center, grabbed a heavy, unauthorized tactical rifle, and began running toward the committee rooms where the princess and the 12 delegates were trapped. The corridors leading to the summit hall had transformed into absolute chaos, choked with fleeing administrative staff, terrified junior aides, and wounded security personnel. Jax moved smoothly against the panicked current of bodies, reading the geometry of the station like a veteran maps out a minefield while running toward the epicenter of the danger. He bypassed the main thoroughfares through a network of cramped, forgotten maintenance tunnels that most station workers didn't even know existed, letting a brief flash of a painful memory from his past wash over him and vanish. He emerged behind the north entrance of the committee chamber just as Kike Dornay's line was beginning to buckle under the relentless pressure of a second Scar assault wave. Inside the sprawling chamber, the 12 Border World delegates were huddled in a tight, terrified cluster behind an overturned conference table while the remaining Threxy guards fought desperately at the doorway. Princess Lyra stood near the center of the room, projecting an artificial calmness that masked the sheer terror gripping everyone present. Jax slipped into the room through a side maintenance panel, his expression as flat and cold as a sheet of industrial steel. He assessed the remaining defenders, only 11 Threxy soldiers left standing, several of them bleeding heavily through cracked armor plates against a force that outnumbered them 10 to 1. Kike Dornay staggered backward from the doorway, a deep plasma burn carving a black trench across the side of his helmet, finally stripped of all his swagger and bravado. He looked at Jax with wild, disbelieving eyes, asking the ultimate question that hung heavy in the smoke-filled air: whether there was anything left they could possibly do to stop the slaughter. Jax stepped past him, picked up a discarded heavy rifle built for hands larger than his own, and told the Threxy commander to pull his surviving people back behind a secondary barricade. As the next wave of Scar soldiers surged toward the narrow doorway, Jax took his position in the frame, turning a fatal bottleneck into an unbreakable wall. The doorway transformed into a brutal, claustrophobic killing floor where sheer numbers meant nothing because the narrow frame only allowed one attacker through at a time. Jax fought not with wild fury, but with the cold, mathematical precision of a machine, his body moving on instincts forged in a forgotten hell called Karen decades ago. He triggered the corridor's overhead environmental controls, venting a thick, blinding chemical fog into the approach that disabled the enemy's thermal optics while his own eyes adjusted effortlessly to the gloom. One by one, the elite Scar Raiders broke themselves against his position, tumbling backward into the corridor as they realized this single human was an impassable obstacle. Behind him, the trapped delegates watched in stunned, breathless silence, realizing that the cheap human bodyguard they had dismissed as a budget afterthought was holding an entire army at bay. Kike Dornay stared in open awe, finally understanding the true gulf between performative warrior culture and the grim, terrifying reality of a veteran who had survived the worst the galaxy had to offer. Through a secure comms channel on his earpiece, Jax heard Ellery's breathless voice reporting that the main Scar fleet had broken formation and was burning hard toward the station, just 4 hours away from obliterating Meridian Point from orbit. The enemy commander on the other side of the comms link suddenly realized that his vanguard had completely stalled against a single defender in a doorway. A chilling, translated voice echoed across the open tactical frequency, demanding the immediate identification of the human holding the line so they could decide whether to commit their final reserves. Jax didn't hesitate. He stepped fully into the light of the doorway where the enemy sensors could capture his face, and spoke his true name into the open channel with absolute, unapologetic clarity, letting the ghosts of his past finally catch up to him. Miles away aboard the massive Scar flagship hovering at the edge of the system, Fleet Marshal Draxus Vale froze in absolute disbelief as the human's name echoed across his command deck. Decades ago, Vale had been a terrified junior officer at the Battle of Karen, where a garrison of just 31 human soldiers had systematically dismantled an entire invading battalion of 400 elite troops. He remembered the mountain turned into a meat grinder, the catastrophic tunnel collapses, and the whispered legends of the demolition specialist who had orchestrated the slaughter from the shadows. The Dominion's high command had buried the file out of sheer embarrassment, but the cold, paralyzing terror of that defeat had never left Vale's soul. His subordinate officers immediately protested, shouting that one human in a doorway shouldn't stop an entire fleet and urging Vale to commit the reserves to crush the station once and for all. But Vale silenced them with a single, icy glare born of hard-earned experience, knowing that officers who shouted the loudest about acceptable risk were never the ones who had to stand in the fire. He gave the absolute order to disengage immediately, recalling every boarding party, breaking the fleet's attack vector, and turning the massive armada around to flee back across the border in panicked retreat. He refused to let his career end the same way his mentors had, crushed beneath the unstoppable legacy of a human soldier named Ethan Voss. Back in the committee chamber, the sudden, deafening silence of retreating gunfire washed over the room like a cool breeze after a scorching wildfire. Ellery's voice broke through the comms network a moment later, confirming with stunned disbelief that every Scar ship had dropped its weapons and was scrambling away from the station at maximum warp. The delegates slowly emerged from behind their barricades, staring at Jax with a mixture of profound awe and unspoken reverence as the heavy reality of their survival settled in. Kike Dornay walked over, his usual swagger entirely gone, and quietly handed Jax a worn service medallion, acknowledging that the human wasn't just a cheap hire, but the savior of them all. The closing session of the summit convened 11 hours later in the scorch-marked committee chamber, but the delay didn't matter because the mood in the room had fundamentally shifted. With 12 border worlds united by the shared trauma and miraculous survival of the attack, the Mutual Defense Pact passed unanimously in less than 40 minutes. Ambassador Lyra signed the historic document with a steady hand, knowing that humanity had forever proven its worth not through expensive armor or loud boasts, but through the quiet, unbreakable courage of a single veteran. The galaxy's perception of humans changed overnight, transforming them from a cheap, overlooked novelty into the most respected defenders in the Concord. Offers for permanent, high-paying security contracts flooded in from across the galaxy, but Jax turned them all down with a gentle, resolute shake of his head, choosing to remain exactly where he was. He knew that permanent positions came with political strings and high commands that he never wanted to hold again, preferring the quiet dignity of a small job done right. When Lyra asked him what he would do next, he simply stated that he would keep standing where he was told and noticing the things other people missed, finding peace in a smaller weight. The ghosts of Karen no longer felt like a crushing burden, but rather a reminder of the friends who had stood beside him in the dark. As Jax walked the dim, quiet corridors of Meridian Point during the night cycle, he felt the heavy medallion in his pocket and knew that his place in the universe had quietly found its balance. He was still considered cheap by the numbers that mattered to corporate ledgers, but he no longer minded the word because he knew the true cost of the life he had preserved. The station hummed peacefully around him, a fragile sphere of life spinning through an indifferent void, protected by a quiet human who understood that true strength didn't need to shout to be heard. The invasion had ended at a doorway he chose not to leave, and for the first time in his long life, the silence that followed felt like home. If you like the video, make sure to like and subscribe my channel.